You're listening
to the CD Baby
Baby
DIY
Musician Podcast.
Hey there, and welcome to another episode of the CD Baby DIY Musician Podcast, episode number 40 to be exact, the big 4-0. My name is Kevin, your host for the show, and today we'll be talking to music publicist Alex Steininger. Those of you who are longtime listeners have probably heard us talking about publicity and publicist on our roundtable edition of the show. More specifically, you probably have heard Chris, who joins me for those episodes, talk about the great press he's been getting and received on his tour down to California and here locally. Well, Alex is Chris's publicist, so we figured it would be fitting to have him on the show. So here is my conversation with Alex Steininger from In Music We Trust.
A record is really a record. It's an archive of a moment in your musical history. And you
the most valuable thing that you have as a musician and artist is what makes you different.
A really good engineer knows how to handle digital and not make it sound like digital.
Politely asked, would you consider featuring this video?
One of the challenges that everybody has is what I call the reality of the glut.
All a journey and a process, and it's not a press.
And I never actually thought that I would do this for a living.
Really, what is art? It's magic. It's this thing that we don't understand.
Alex, thanks for joining us on the podcast.
Kevin, thanks for having me.
Well, why don't you start out by kind of defining what the role is of a publicist and how it's different than, say, like a marketing person? Because a lot of times I think artists get that confused who haven't really dealt with a publicist before.
Okay, the job of the publicist is to raise awareness of their client, the artist, band, singer-songwriter, whatever, artist, in the media, whether that's, online blogs, webzines, print media, your dailies and weeklies in each tour market, and national magazines from, national magazine newsprint to full national glossies like Rolling Stone and Spin. It's each time you do something, a tour or a record, is to make journalists and make these publications aware of the artist and aware of what the artist is doing. And then from there, hopefully they've made them aware of it. Then they've made them aware of, say, a new record. So they get them to actually listen to that record and then give them feedback on it. And from there, hopefully cover it and get some coverage on it.
So the difference would be a marketing person would be more of like marketing the product to the public, and you're more of getting the word out to the media.
As far as the difference, I mean, like, a marketing person for a label would market the album and make sure that record's marketed to retail and to consumer outlets, everything from a shoe store or a clothing store to a record store, to different chains, to make sure that record's there and visible in that chain to the consumers. Whereas the publicist is working with the media. A marketing person basically works. Marketing person's going to work B2B, business to business, making sure that their clientele, the businesses, are aware of it, so their consumers are aware of it. And then the publicist is still a little B2B, little business to business, but you got to make the journalists aware of it so they can write about it and make their readers aware of it.
So at what point is it important for an artist to bring in a publicist? Is it just when they're getting to release a new album or a tour, or what kind of publicity campaigns do you do a lot for musicians?
Well, I mean, the two key ones are, the biggest one is when you put out a new record. You definitely want to have a publicist there to work the new record. No use having them come on board 6-9 months after the record's been out. So the best time is right before the new record hits, so they can set up the new record and get coverage for it when it's a new record and kind of maximize exposure for that new record. But also for every tour you do. So when you go on the road, the papers and the journalists in each market know you're there, so they can write about you, and hopefully their readers will know about you and go to your shows. I work with a lot of bands on new records, a lot of bands on tours. Some bands, I'll sit down with them, and they may not I mean, budget-wise, they may not be ready for a publicist. I always tell people, if it comes down to it, and it's between touring and hiring a publicist, monetarily, use your money to get on the road, because I still think touring and getting out and playing in front of people is the number one thing to do right now. But once that base is covered, if you're out there touring and playing shows and you want to raise awareness of your band and raise your visibility, definitely that's the time to take on a publicist.
You mentioned the monetary value of it. You don't necessarily have to share your fees on the podcast, but do you have different levels of things you do as far as like if there's a band that maybe is just kind of has a buzz going, say, here in Portland and really just playing around this general area? Is there sort of a campaign that you might gear towards that as opposed to a band that's hitting the road nationally? And
oh, yes, most definitely. And actually that kind of goes back into the last question where, bands will come to me and they'll be like, hey, do we need a publicist? And so I'll sit down with them, talk to them, and they'll tell me, hey, we're just playing Portland. We have this new record. We're just playing Portland. We're not going to go national. We don't have distribution for the record besides something like CD Baby. We have a website and a MySpace page and CD Baby, and it's on iTunes and all that's covered, but we don't have, retail distribution for the record. We're not playing outside of Portland, so we don't see a need for distribution. But we want to get it written up locally. So I tell them, hey, you may not be ready for a publicist nationally. You're not ready. Therefore, that tells me you're not ready. If you don't think you're ready, if there's any hesitation, follow your gut on that. So I would never take that record nationally. But I do tell them like, hey, you want to make the biggest splash you can in Portland? Why don't I just work the Portland CD release show? And some other bands come to me like, hey, we've had a record out for a year. We worked our tail off trying to record this record, get it out there. We scraped through every penny we have, but we've been playing a bunch of shows and we're not getting covered, but we have a little money now. We're playing Portland, Seattle, Eugene, Corvallis. Do you think we could use your services? And I say, yes, definitely. I can do some regional tour press for you. Going to the new question. So yeah, depending on what they want, I sit down with a client, I assess their needs. And if they want, a full national big push and they're touring a lot, I work out a deal for them. Like Chris Robley, who has a new record and he's going to be touring over the next year, I'll work out a deal for him on that. Whereas if someone's like, hey, we have a new record, we just need it work to Portland outlets, work out a different deal for them on that.
So what's the workflow like for you? I mean, so you start working with a band, and do you just send out press releases to everybody you know, or do you just make a lot of phone calls, or how does that work? Because I know you mentioned Chris, and he's a part of our podcast and was raving about the job you did for one of his tours down to California, and he got written up at the LA Times and all these other places. So you just like on the phone with all these people, or you having Chris send out stuff, or how does that work?
Well, yeah, I mean, what will happen is I'll listen to a record, I'll determine the audience for it, the journalist I want to send it to, then they'll give me the tour dates. So first of all, we'll go back to the core of it. We have a new record. I listen to the new record and we want to take it nationally. So I figure who on a national level I want to send that record to. And then I give clients a cover letter. We finalize a bio, and then we finalize a press release that I write and they approve it. And then I give them labels and a cover letter and the bio to send out, and I tell them who to send it to. I mean, for an extra fee, I'll do the mail outs. It's just really a pain to stuff 300 envelopes, and my time could be used better elsewhere, so I prefer not to do that. And so, yeah, a lot of times I do have the clients do the mail out, so I tell them who to mail it to. They mail it out, and then I follow up with a press release, and then follow up emails and follow up phone calls until I get a response. I hound people until they tell me either, A, yes, I'm going to cover it, B, I'm not going to cover it. We're passing on it. I didn't like it. Or, C, sorry, just I don't have time right now. But until I get a response, I keep trying to follow up people via any means I can. If a honing pigeon would get a hold of someone, I'd use that.
Well, you mentioned that the band is supplying some of those, things to send out. So what should a band have? Like you mentioned a bio. Do they need to have like a good one sheet or a nicely done CD, or does it even... What is all involved with the mail out?
Yeah, I mean, ideally at the core of it, I want them to have a good looking CD. If they have just a CDR with like handwriting on it, I'd sit back with them and be like, look, here's what's going to happen. People are going to look at that. Even if I do my hardest to get people to listen to this and get them, on the phone, email them and raise their awareness of it and make them aware of this. The end result is they're going to look at the CD and CDR with handwriting on there and be like, and they're not going to listen to it. And they're going to be like, sorry, Alex, I got the CD. Don't have time to listen to it. Or it looked like it didn't look professional. I'm not going to listen to it. So, at the core of it, I want them to have a really nice looking CD, like Chris Robley's new one, a double fold out digipack. But no, from there, I'll ask them questions. And then from there, after they answer my questions, I'll develop a press release. I sit down, listen to a record, and then I send them questions that they answer. And then from those questions that they answer, I find out the angle that I want to pitch it to. And then I'll write a press release on that. And once they approve the press release, then I'll sit down with them and, for an extra fee, I can write the bio, or if they have one, I'll look over their bio and just make some tweaks for them and be like, okay, well, here's a decent bio. But I always tell artists, a bio should be a feature-length article you wouldn't mind being reprinted verbatim in a newspaper. Like, you'd sit down and read an article. That should be a bio. People always want to be like, hey, I was born this day, and this guy was born this day. And, we went to high school together, and, we started playing together. And they tell out their whole life story. And I'm like, okay, it is a bio, but I like bios to be about the present, a little recap about mentionables, band members, bands they've been in that are notable, and some impressive facts, press quotes, tours you've done that will grab attention. But the rest of it should be about, you should condense all of that, the past, into a few paragraphs. But then the bio should be about the product you're pitching, which is the current record. So the bio should tell the past and weave that into the current product you're working. So I work with clients, either write that myself and have them approve it, or work with them to tweak what they already have.
Do you find that a lot of press are just reprinting that instead of writing up their own little article?
Sometimes yes. Sometimes they'll just use. I've had bios reprinted verbatim in the newspapers. So much so that it even said at the bottom, for more information, please contact Alex Steininger and Musically Trust PR with my address, phone number, and email address at the bottom. And at the top, it had a writer's name credited for it. And then I called the writer, and I'm like, hey, what do you get paid per word? And he was like, 20 cents. And I'm like, wow, you got paid for my work. Nice. Because so did I. But, next time you rip off my work verbatim, which I don't mind, which is why I wrote it for you, please, take out my contact information. That just kind of made it feel like you put my press release in there and my bio in there, and you didn't make it editorial, which kind of lessens the blow from a reader, I thought. Yeah. And the writer was like, oh man, the editor was supposed to catch that. I'm sorry. I'm like, no worries. But other times I have people they'll take paragraphs out and then write the rest themselves, which I don't mind at all. I mean, I write it and send it out as something I wouldn't mind being reprinted in entirety. So whatever they use, I don't mind. But yeah, it does happen a lot more than you'd think.
How should an artist or a band start looking for a publicist? I mean, if there's a lot of people out there that are making promises to artists, and what are some key things they should look when trying to consider a publicist?
I always have these meetings with artists who are like, hey, I hired this publicist before in LA, and we didn't get anything, and it was a big waste of money. And for me, that's a big uphill battle I got to deal with on some people who are really jaded because they've been through that experience before. And I've had bands come to me like, what should I look for in a publicist? And I tell them, one, someone that's going to be communicative, that you feel you can communicate with, and that gets back to you. Two, someone you like to deal with. You talk to them on the phone, you talk to them on email, and you like their communication. If you get like emails from somebody that you want to work with, and you're just like, oh man, their grammar is so bad, it's horrible. I don't like. Is this them? Is this how they are with me, or is this how they are with everybody? That should be a red flag. So you should find someone that you like to communicate with, both verbally and written word. And then 3, find someone that you feel you feel you're aligned with musically. Look who they've worked with and feel like, oh, those are bands that are aligned with me, or okay, I like those bands. I like their taste in music. And then 4, make sure that the publicist really, is into the music. Because I've worked records before where I've told clients straight up, like, I don't really like this record. I've worked for labels before where like, I've worked other releases which I've loved and, got a relationship with them. And then you tell them like, hey, I don't like this record. And they're like, oh, well, still, can you work it? I mean, yeah, but ideally, I wouldn't. And so I always make it clear to someone about that if I don't like it. And I haven't done that in many years. But when I got started out, I worked some records that I didn't like, but I was very clear, like, I'm not into it. So sometimes people are like, okay, cool, thanks. And they'd walk. Other times they'd be like, well, you did good on the last record that we did. Yeah, because I love that record. Yeah. You want to work with this one? I mean, I'll work it, sure, but I'm just giving you a heads up. And they're like, okay. So make sure that they really like the music. Just like anything, if you're not into something, whether it's, working at McDonald's or, playing in a band or doing publicity or, being on an actor on a TV show or whatever it is, if you're not enthusiastic about it and you can't get into it, the people you're dealing with are going to get that, and it's going to come across. Like if I were to work a record I didn't really like, journalists would be like, oh, well, you're not that enthusiastic about it. Why should I be enthusiastic about it? So I mean, that enthusiasm goes a long way if it's genuine. From me being a journalist myself, I deal with publicists who are just, every record's the greatest record ever they've ever heard. It's amazing. And then, after a while you're like, really? So you just happen to stumble onto your favorite record of all time every month.
Well, how do you get through to them bringing that up? I'm sure that, they're getting all calls from tons of publicists saying this is the greatest record ever, just like you said. How do you actually get through to them with some enthusiasm without just overhyping it?
That's a good question. Thanks for asking it, actually. I deal with that a lot. A lot of it's relationships, and it's based on trust, and a journalist gets to know to trust you. And I've called up people before and been like, hey, I really like this record, but you know what? I don't really think it's up your alley, but I think it's up at your alley enough to cover it. And more so on like tour press, because you have a music editor for a paper who's the music editor for that paper, and they may be really into indie rock, and Pavement may be their favorite band, and you're working an alt country record, and they may hate alt country, but you call them up and be like, hey, look, here's the thing, I really like this record. I know it's not your thing, but they do have a show in Columbus, Ohio, and it's at a good venue, and they're on a good bill. I really think you should take a consideration for this and cover it. And just be honest, and they're like, okay, cool. Well, what's the story? What's the angle? And so if you don't think you can sell a journalist on them like being blown away by the record, you try to sell them on the angle. Like, here's the story, and it's going to make a good story, so it's going to be easy for them to write. Just because they have to crank out some words, and if they're not into the record, they've got to have an angle to write about it. But I always come to people. Very rarely do I like, hey, this is amazing. This is the greatest record ever. I call them up and be like, hey, I've been listening to this record a lot. I really like it. I'm into it. What do you think about it? And then over years, you kind of develop that relationship where, you know what someone's going to like, what they're not going to like. They know your tastes. And I'm trying to, sorry for me kind of meandering here, but I'm trying to answer the question as directly, trying to get more to the heart of it. But I basically never tell someone like, hey, this is the greatest record ever. This is amazing. It will blow your mind. I tell them like, hey, I really like this record. Here's what it sounds like, and here's why I like it. Like with Chris Robley, we used, a lot the Stephen King of indie pop. I use that a lot. And some people come back and be like, oh, it's really Elliott Smith-ish. And I'd be like, I don't quite agree. But, it's this dark kind of brooding folk with indie rock, elements to it, poppy and melodic, but still kind of dissonant at times. And it's got these great, lyrics, great storytelling there. And I'm a huge fan of Chris Robley. What do you think of it? And when you saw it that way, it's like, oh, cool, that sounds interesting. They listen to it and they come back and they're like, oh, this guy's great. I do like it. Or they're like, oh, not my thing musically. Mm-hmm. And back to the question, like, yeah, I a lot of publicists do, like, this record's amazing. You got to check it out. It's amazing. Woo. And you just try to, since everyone is doing that, you try to catch their attention outside the norm. You try to, like, okay, their doors are getting beaten down daily with someone telling how great this record is. So you got to tell them how, instead of telling them, how great it is. I'm working with this new band, and, I wrote them a bio, and they're like, well, we really like our bio. And I'm like, well, okay, here's the problem with your bio. You use the word genius, guitar god, and brilliant.
I don't even have to read the rest of the bio.
And I'm like, dude, first, a journalist is going to read that, and it's going to make them gag. They're going to be really turned off. Let's tone this down. Like, we have to find a way to tell them all that in other words, So saying like, oh, this guy's the next best thing since Keith Richards. You got to find a more normal, mundane way of saying that, but saying something like, driven by the guitars, pushes the melody, and, it crosses between, Rolling Stones, to the next song being very, whatever, Driving Wilburys. And you just come up with that, and you got to make someone, instead of being like, oh, this is just brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. You got to like say that in ways like, oh, it's, it's great, but here's it's not great because great's such a general term, but here's what we think it sounds like, and get them to listen to it and make their own opinion.
You brought up the idea of having an angle a couple times, and on the podcast, we're always talking about artists developing their story because, I find, here at CD Baby and people emailing the podcast and just CD Baby, they always do that, say we're the greatest, and they kind of just use a lot of those terms, but they don't ever really give you any reason to want to find out more about them. So are there any particular angles that you see working time and time again with the press or storylines that seem to be written about a lot?
Yeah, I mean, I hate to keep referring and plugging Chris Robley here, but since
That's all we do at CD Baby anyway.
Since he is part of the podcast and he does work here, and hopefully listeners know who he is, I am his publicist, I'm going to refer to him. With his last record, he's like, Alex, there's no angle, And I'm like, well, here, answer my questions, and then let me worry about finding the angle for you. So he answered all the questions I asked him, and then I came back and said, okay, here's your angle. 20-something-year-old guy, holds down steady J job, happily married, never done drugs, not depressed, writes these kind of like, in a lot of ways, horrifying stories about, kind of despondent, down on their luck people. Dark songs. We'll simplify and say dark songs. He writes these dark tales of kind of tragic Americana, if you will. And, the kind of short novels and songs that are about people in bad spots or bad situations, depression, darkness, standard fare. But he writes this all from not from a standpoint of this, this a guy that's been dumped a lot and is depressed and writes a bunch of songs out of depression, or has just done a lot of drugs. So I said, that's your angle. You're this normal 20-something-year-old guy with a job that makes these dark records, and it's not out of any darkness in your life. It's just out of a fascination of people. So we spun it out of that, and so I said, here's some more questions, answer these. And he answered more questions. Then I wrote up a bio for him. He's like, oh my God, wow. Like, I didn't think there was an angle beforehand, but there's an angle here. And I said, yeah. And I've dealt with other people like that, where they come like, oh, I don't have a story. I'm like, okay, well, let's sit down and really think about it. And 9 times out of 10, if you really sit and you prod and ask the right questions, you can find a story. So for bands trying to find their own story, just trying to find something that even the most minuscule, minute thing that you can like, oh, okay, that would be interesting. I could spin that. Watch the news, read the newspaper. Look around. If you watch I read the Metro section every day of the Oregonian, and they take like the littlest things and they can blow them into like these huge, like, mind-numbing scare tactics. like Meth Watch. I was addicted to the Oregonian's Meth Watch coverage. And it made me paranoid, like I'm going to walk down the street and some meth addict's just going to kill me so we can get a fix. Like meth is huge in Portland. It's everywhere. Oh my God. And they just took this like, I don't want to belittle the situation or, belittle an addict or belittle someone that's been a victim of it. But they took this thing, that's probably been around forever and just made it like hot news right now and made it like this whole sensationalism. And not that you want to hype up your band as much as, that and just like over bombard people. But, something as simple as you sit down, you wrote a record and you happen to, you're like, oh, there's no angle with us. We're just 4 guys that happen to write this record. Well, what's the record about? Oh, it's about this 1942 Civil War, photos we found from our house when we remodeled it. And they were just, the old owner of the house left all these photos, and we wrote an album about these photos, which was some band in Portland did something similar to that. But you can turn that into the whole story right there. And you're like, oh, well, there's your angle. There's your story right there. That's fascinating.
Yeah, I think that's a good example because I think most bands are trying to think of some earth-shattering story as opposed to just taking something small like that and turning it into the kind of a storyline that goes along with them as an artist, not the defining story of their artistic career.
I've dealt with other artists who are like, oh, my story is, I hired Jackson Brown's bass player. I hired, Tom Petty's drummer. I hired, all these guys to play on my record. I made this record with all these like named people. It's great. Your story is you have a lot of money? That's your story? Well, no, I have all these people that came on the record. They on the record because they're your friends and they wanted to help out in the studio and they stopped by and you made this record because just friends stopped by and made a record? No, I hired them. I booked them. Yeah, not really a story there, you know. I put out a record for a band that had Steve Albini produce the record. Like, our whole story is Steve Albini did Nirvana and he did our record. Well, he didn't do your record because he was he may became a fan later, but I'm like, he didn't do the record because he saw you guys at a club and loved you and brought you in and was like, let's record this record. You called him up, booked some studio time and hired him and spent $15,000. That's not the story, guys. Yeah. And so I deal with these artists who are like, oh, we have all these like name people. Well, you know, if your name's Joe Smith and people don't recognize you as Joe Smith, they have to be like, Joe Smith drummed on the first 4, whatever records. It's not really a name. You're selling it off of someone else's name. That story's not there. So I had this guy that was like, I had all these key players play on the record. Like, I went to New York. I recorded this record with like a bunch of like big name people or big name people's backing people. That's our story. Well, I mean, we'll definitely mention that in there, but I don't think that's the story of you, So we dug deeper, and the story was, he believed enough in his music that he dropped out of school, disappointed his parents, gave up on that big degree and that high fancy, New York skyscraper job. It was like, you know what? Here's all my savings, everything I have. I'm going to put it in this record. I'm going to hire these people to play the record. I'm like, that's your story right there. And he's like, oh wow, that is a better story. I'm like, yeah, just because you had money and you come off like, oh, I hire all these people to play on my record. You're gonna come off as an arrogant, rich, person that was like, oh, great, and why should I care? But here, your story is you gave up, like you disappointed your parents, you gave up. You're in the middle of your NYU degree, and you're gonna be in the banking just like your dad, and you've got this whole life ahead of you. White picket fence, upstate New York, just this, this cushy life. And you're like, you know what? I don't want that. I'm going to gamble. I believe enough in myself. I'm going to gamble. I'm going to roll the dice, spend every penny I have. And if I fall on my face, I guess I don't have to go wait tables until I can save enough money to go back to school. I'm like, that's the story right there.
That is a good story.
Yeah. And he was like, oh, wow. Okay, thanks. And so if you sit and talk to someone long enough where you really just think and rack your brain, there's a way you can spin the story, which his was he dropped out of school and made a record. A lot of people have done that, but his was, we took it further and we just, let's just accentuate the fact that you dropped out of school and took every dime you had and hired these people. Other people have done that too, but other people haven't really, you got to accentuate it, and that's your story on this record.
Do you find that it's easier for indie artists to get press coverage these days as opposed to maybe 5-10 years ago?
No, actually 5 or 10 years ago, there was more papers, there was more space, more ad dollars. It was easier. I've been doing press now, professionally for 10 years. And, no, when I started, it was a lot easier. And then, as space dwindled, magazines shut down, it gets harder and harder. It's easier to get more widespread press, with blogs and the internet and stuff. But there's just so much more out there that you're just competing with more, and you're competing for less space. There's people like, oh, there's so much blogs, there's so much more out there now than there was before. Well, there's also like 10 times more people putting out records, so it seems, or people sending it out there. With the internet, it's easier for people to, come across stuff and just start inundating people with music. I started out as an online magazine, and just over the years, my increase of mail I get is just year after year it like doubles. I'm up to like 50 packages a week now, and it's just like lines my bedroom. I have people come over, I'm like, look, I haven't opened mail in 3 months. And I have people come over to my house and like, wow, you haven't opened mail in 3 months. Like, wow, like is there great stuff in there? I'm like, yeah, probably. They're like, well, how do you find stuff to listen to? I'm like, Publicist. Someone calls me enough and hounds me enough about something, I'll open it. Someone that doesn't hound me and doesn't, really like keep me on, my toes, it sits in the pile. And, every, now the holidays are coming up, I'm going to open all my mail, and, I'm sure I'll find stuff. Like I opened some mail last night and I found the what I like to call new 6 months ago Ryan Adams record, which I was really excited about 6 months ago. And then it got lost in the pile. I could never find it. I found it. Been listening to that. I'm like, oh, awesome. No one ever followed up with me on that. I guess I was too low on, Lost Highways list for that for my mag, but it was there. But then I found a lot of other great indie stuff because people just like, Publicists, they hounded me.
You mentioned blogs and stuff. Do you see them having a big impact? Is it still like traditional press, still a much more valuable type write-up than like a blog? Or
it depends on the publication. I mean, a magnet review over your neighbor's blog, of course, is going to carry more weight. An Oregonian or local, weekly or daily review over your neighbor's blog is going to carry more weight. But there's definitely some key blogs out there where if you can get covered by them, it's just it's an avalanche effect where you can leverage that, just like some good print media press. You can leverage that press into other stuff.
What are some of the blogs you think are worthwhile?
Aquarium Drunkard. There's My Old Kentucky Blog. Pink is the New Blog. Yellow Stereo. I mean, there's some key ones out there where if they cover it, it really adds up and matters. Let's see, Day Trotter.
Do you put much effort into Pitchfork?
Oh yeah, of course. For certain records I know just Pitchfork isn't going to like a cover. But yeah, I mean, there's certain records that I'll push super, super hard to Pitchfork because it demographically it works. Mm-hmm. And so I want it in there. And I mean, Pitchfork carries a lot of weight out of anything. I mean, right now, Pitchfork, probably one of the most valuable magazines out there for indie musicians in the indie rock genre. I mean, if you're an indie, and it's hard. It's like if you're an indie musician who specializes in world music, Pitchforks isn't going to mean a thing to you. Plus, we're not going to cover it. There's probably world music out there. But for what I do, like Pitchfork's kind of, the gospel in a lot of ways. Like, if you get covered there, I mean, it really helps, and you can use Pitchfork reviews for leverage with other people.
Well, before we wrap up, I just wanted to ask, how long do you normally employ a publicist for, like, working your new record? I mean, is it something that you're just ongoing, or is it like you normally say, I'm going to work a 6-month run, and here's what it's going to cost for monthly type thing? Or
well, that depends on your touring schedule and how long you're going to tour for the record. But just for a general 3-month, or just for a general working a new record, there's normally a 3-month cycle for a new record to national media, just based around the record itself and the record being new, not including tours or anything. So if you're just going to hire a publicist for a record, 3 months pretty minimum for a national campaign. If you're going to tour outside that, you'll want to work on that. But if you're putting out a record not touring, if it boils down to that kind of common denominator, then 3 months.
Cool. Well, if somebody wanted to hire you as a publicist, where would they reach you?
They can reach me at Alex, ALEX, at inmusicwetrust.com. And of course, we're on the web at inmusicwetrust.com.
All right. Thanks, man, for stopping by.
Thank you.
That's going to do it for this edition of the podcast. Before we go, I wanted to say that if you're enjoying this podcast and you use iTunes to subscribe, it would help us out a lot if you could leave us some positive feedback on our iTunes page. We would really appreciate that. And also, I wanted to let you know we'll be recording our final roundtable edition of the podcast for the year 2008. We'll be closing out the year coming up this week. So if you have any comments, stories, or New Year's wishes that you want to phone in with, there's still time to call our listener line, and the number is 206-426-5683. And of course, we're on the web at cdbabypodcast.com. We'll catch you next time. Bye. You've been listening to the CD Baby DIY Musician Podcast, broadcasting from Portland, Oregon, USA.